All right, let's talk about something that's a really big deal in U.S. foreign policy, but honestly doesn't get talked about enough. The invasion of Panama back in 1989. It was fast, it was brutal, and people are still arguing about it today. So we're going to break it all down.
So let's set the scene. It's December 20th, 1989, just 5 days before Christmas. While most people are thinking about the holidays, the United States, well, they were gearing up for something completely different. They were preparing for war.
And get this, we're talking about almost 27,000 U.S. troops. I mean, think about that number. That is a massive force, especially when you consider they were heading into a country that didn't even have its own standing army. Yeah, this was actually one of the biggest U.S. military operations since Vietnam, a full-on air and ground assault, all focused on this one small nation in Central America. So that brings us to the big question, right? Why? Why send so many troops to invade this tiny country? And, well, the answer, it's a lot more complicated than it might seem on the surface. Okay, so to really get into the why, we have to start with the official story. The reasons the U.S. government gave at the time. They even gave the mission a pretty loaded codename, Operation Just Cause. The Bush administration at the time basically laid out 4 key reasons. They said it was to protect American citizens there, to defend democracy, to fight drug trafficking, and, of course, to make sure the Panama Canal was secure. But the final straw, the event that was used as the immediate trigger, it happened just a few days before the invasion. A U.S. Marine was killed at a checkpoint. And that tragic incident, that was the spark. But honestly, to get the real story, we need to look past the official reasons and focus on one person at the very center of this whole mess. And that man's name is Manuel Noriega. His story, wow. It's really the key to understanding this whole conflict. It's a wild tale of contradictions and, let's just say, some very flexible loyalties. So, who was Noriega? Well, he was basically Panama's military dictator. But here's the twist. For decades, he was also on the CIA's payroll. That's right, he was a key American partner in Central America, especially during the Cold War. This right here kind of says it all. You've got this two-sided coin. For years, the U.S. pretty much looked the other way while Noriega was involved in all sorts of shady stuff. We're talking corruption, even drug trafficking. Why? Because he was useful. He was their guy against communism in the region. But by the late 80s, that whole arrangement, it was starting to fall apart, big time. And when things went bad, they went bad fast. In '88, U.S. federal courts actually indicted him on drug charges. Then, the next year, he holds an election, his guy loses, and what does he do? He just cancels the results. Poof, gone. Just like that, the U.S. ally had turned into a full-blown enemy and a showdown was pretty much inevitable. But look, as important as Noriega was to the story, he's still just one part of it. If you really want to understand why the U.S. cared so much about this little country, you have to look at the one thing in Panama that was, and still is, incredibly valuable. Of course, I'm talking about the Panama Canal. I mean, for the better part of a century, this thing was more than just a waterway. It was a symbol of American might. It literally sliced the travel time between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. It was an absolute game changer for world trade and for the U.S. Navy. Now, this history of U.S. control didn't exactly make everyone in Panama happy. There was a lot of resentment. In 1977, treaties were signed that basically promised Panama would get the canal back by the year 2000. So you can imagine, with Noriega getting more and more unpredictable and hostile, people in Washington started to get really nervous about the future of this super important asset. So, with all that tension in the air, the stage was set. And what happened next was fast, it was destructive, and honestly, the human cost was just staggering. The invasion itself was incredibly quick and intense. The U.S. military, with all its technology, just steamrolled the Panamanian forces. But the really critical thing to remember is where this fighting happened. A lot of it was in crowded city neighborhoods, which meant ordinary people, civilians, were caught right in the middle of it all. When you look at the military numbers, they're pretty lopsided. About 23 American soldiers lost their lives, compared to around 300 Panamanian soldiers. But those numbers, they don't even begin to tell the whole story. Because this is where things get really controversial and really tragic. The official U.S. government estimate for civilian deaths was about 300. But if you talk to human rights organizations or look at Panamanian records, that number explodes to anywhere from 500 to maybe even over 3,000.
We still don't know the true number, and for many, it's still a very painful, unresolved issue. To give you an idea of the devastation, there was this one poor neighborhood, El Chorrillo, right next to Noriega's headquarters. The people who lived there started calling it Little Hiroshima. Think about that. The area was just completely flattened, and it became this powerful symbol of just how devastating the invasion was for regular people.
And what about Noriega? Well, he ended up hiding out in the Vatican's embassy for about 10 days. It was this super tense standoff. But eventually he surrendered. And just like that, the former CIA asset was put on a plane to the US. Not as a partner anymore, but as a prisoner about to face trial. So what are we left with? What's the legacy of all this? This is where the story really splits into two totally different narratives. It's like two separate histories of the exact same event. You can see it right in the name people use. In the US, you'll often hear the official codename Operation Just Cause. But in Panama, for most people there, it's just called the invasion. That says a lot, doesn't it? So while the US saw it as a successful mission that got rid of a dictator and restored democracy, the rest of the world wasn't so sure. The UN General Assembly actually condemned it, calling it a violation of international law. And in Panama itself, the effects were profound. They completely got rid of their military after this, and now every December 20th is a national day of mourning to remember everyone who was lost. Which leaves us with this really tough question, doesn't it? How should we remember this? On one hand, a corrupt, brutal dictator was removed from power. But on the other hand, thousands of civilians may have paid the ultimate price. It's a complicated legacy, and it really makes you think about the true cost of these interventions. And more importantly, who ends up paying that cost?